It was a quiet Tuesday night, just me, my old car, and the empty back roads stretching endlessly under a dark sky. I'd been driving Uber for years, seen all types of passengers, heard all kinds of stories. But tonight, something felt different. The air felt thicker, colder, and the night was darker than usual. Maybe it was just the lack of sleep getting to me, or maybe it was because I'd been driving in unfamiliar parts, but the quiet was unsettling. Then, a ping. I pulled over, glanced at the screen, and saw an address that wasn't far, a few miles down the road, near an area I didn't usually drive in. The picture showed a young woman, dark hair, pale face, with the name Emily. Something about her eyes in the profile picture made me feel uneasy, but I shrugged it off. It was just a photo, and this was just a job. I hit accept. I found myself driving through a dense stretch of woods, the kind where trees clawed over the road, swallowing the moonlight. I followed the GPS until I reached a narrow dirt lane, and there, standing in the shadows, was Emily. She looked exactly like her profile picture, only, she wasn't wearing shoes. Her hair was wet, hanging over her shoulders like she'd just stepped out of the rain. But there was no rain tonight. "Hi," she said in a soft voice, sliding into the back seat. Her eyes were distant, looking out into the dark as if she could see something I couldn't. "Thank you for picking me up." "No problem," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where to?" "Home," she replied simply. I looked at the GPS. No address had been entered, the line on the screen was just a squiggly path leading deeper into the forest. I didn't argue, I've had people give directions before, but as I started driving, my mind began to race with questions. Why was she barefoot? Why had she been standing alone in the woods? We drove in silence for a while. Occasionally, I'd glance in the rearview mirror, trying to catch her eye, but she kept staring out the window, her face expressionless. Finally, I couldn't hold back. "Were you waiting out here for a long time?" She looked at me in the mirror, her eyes hollow and dark, as if she hadn't slept in days. "Yes," she whispered. "A long, long time." The answer sent a shiver down my spine. Her voice was barely audible, yet it echoed in my ears, like a distant memory. I wanted to turn back, make an excuse, anything to get out of this situation, but something about her gaze held me in place, forcing me to drive forward. Minutes passed. The road became narrower, and the trees seemed to press closer, their branches scraping the sides of the car like fingers. The GPS signal started to flicker, and my phone screen went dark. Panic crept in, but Emily didn't react, she just kept staring out the window. Suddenly, she spoke. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I forced a laugh. "Not really. Do you?" She nodded slowly, a hint of a smile crossing her lips. "Yes. I am one." The words hit me like ice water. I glanced back at her, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. She was still there, looking just as real as anyone else, but something in her eyes was wrong, empty, lifeless. I turned my gaze back to the road, trying to focus. This was just some twisted prank, I thought. She was probably messing with me. But then, I looked down and realized that her feet, bare, pale, and dirty, were floating a few inches above the seat. My heart pounded as I slammed the brakes. The car jerked to a stop, and I turned around, only to find the back seat empty. Emily was gone. The air was freezing, my breath coming out in clouds as I stared at the empty space where she'd been. But before I could react, a cold hand touched my shoulder. I whipped around, and there she was, her face inches from mine, her eyes hollow and endless. Her voice was a whisper, like a gust of wind. "Take me home," she pleaded. I never made it home. Suddenly, the world around us shifted. The car was no longer on the road but submerged in murky water, the seats soaked, and a faint smell of rot filling the air. My heart raced as I looked around, realizing that this wasn't my car anymore. It was an old, rusted wreck, half buried under the lake we'd been driving near. I clawed at the door handle, desperate to escape, but my hands slipped through it like mist. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. Emily's face was inches from mine, her voice calm, almost gentle. No one ever found me. But now, you're here. And as darkness closed in, I understood. I wasn't going home. Not ever. Driving for Uber at night has its perks. Less traffic, more quiet, and the types of passengers who usually just want to get home. But this night was different. My phone had been silent for hours, so when I finally got a ride request just past 2 a.m., I was relieved. It was a strange pickup spot though, an old rest area at the edge of town, right where the highway split off into miles of forest. The name on the request was Aaron. No profile picture, which wasn't that unusual, but there was something about it that unsettled me. Still, I had bills to pay, and if Aaron was stranded out there, I was his best shot of getting anywhere safe. When I arrived, no one was in sight. Just my headlights illuminating the cracked pavement and the warped, faded rest stop sign hanging from a broken chain. I was about to cancel the ride when I saw him standing in the shadows, just outside the glow of my lights. He was tall, thin, and dressed in black, wearing a hood that shadowed most of his face. He walked toward the car with slow, deliberate steps. As he got in the back seat, a chill settled in the car. He didn't say a word, just nodded in the mirror. His face was mostly hidden, but something about him seemed wrong. Like he didn't quite fit. His limbs seemed slightly too long, his skin a shade too pale. Where to? I asked, forcing a smile and trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The cemetery, he said, his voice low and cold. A knot tightened in my stomach. There was only one cemetery out this way, a desolate plot of land out in the woods where no one had been buried in decades. I laughed nervously, hoping he was just messing with me. You're serious? Yes, he said, with no trace of humor. I glanced at him in the mirror again, catching a flash of his eyes. They were dark, sunken, like he hadn't slept in years. I looked back at the road, my heart pounding as I drove deeper into the night. The headlights cut through a dense fog that seemed to thicken the further we went. For the first few minutes, the silence was unbearable. I tried to break it with small talk, but he didn't respond. He just stared out the window, his hands folded in his lap in a way that seemed unnatural. Finally, I couldn't hold back. So, what takes you to the cemetery this late? There was a long pause. Then he said, I have unfinished business there. I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel tighter. My skin felt cold, clammy, and every nerve in my body was telling me to turn around. But I was already on the road, miles from anywhere, with no easy way to get out. And he just kept staring out the window, his face emotionless, like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. The car radio suddenly crackled to life, static hissing loudly in the quiet. I hadn't touched the dial. I turned it off, but as soon as I did, I felt a hand on my shoulder, ice cold, strong, gripping me tightly. I froze, barely able to breathe. You missed the turn, he whispered, his breath chilling my ear. I hadn't missed any turn. But when I looked at the GPS, it was showing a new route, one that led straight into the middle of the woods, down a road I'd never seen before. I glanced in the mirror, and that's when I saw it. His hood had slipped, revealing his face. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, his eyes wide and staring, as if they were bulging out of his head. And his mouth, oh, God, his mouth was twisted into a grin that showed far too many teeth, yellowed and sharp, almost like fangs. I slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. It just kept rolling forward, deeper into the fog, down the road I hadn't chosen. My pulse thundered in my ears as I tried to pull over, tried to do anything, but the steering wheel wouldn't budge, and my foot felt locked to the pedal. "Drive," he commanded, his voice echoing in my skull. "It's almost time." The world outside the car grew darker, colder, as if we were sinking into something vast and empty. I watched in horror as the trees began to change, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes, like hands reaching out to grab us. The fog thickened until it was nearly black, pressing against the windows like it wanted to get in. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw shapes moving in the darkness. Pale faces, watching us from the side of the road, their eyes blank and dead, their mouths open in silent screams. They seemed to be waiting for something, gathering in the shadows as we passed. What are they?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "They're the others," he said, his grin widening. "The ones who didn't make it. But they'll be coming along soon." I felt the car slowing down, but I wasn't the one driving anymore. He was. He was steering us straight toward a clearing in the woods, where the trees opened up into a barren, twisted graveyard, the tombstones broken and covered in moss. The car came to a stop, and the man leaned forward, his face inches from mine, his breath like the smell of earth and decay. "This is the end of the line," he whispered, his voice curling around me like a death shroud. I threw open the door and ran, stumbling out into the graveyard. But the fog was everywhere, thick and choking, and the shadows moved like they were alive, closing in around me. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and steady, as he followed, his laughter echoing in the darkness. I ran through the maze of headstones, desperately looking for a way out, but every path led back to him, standing there, waiting, his arms open, like he was welcoming me to a new life, a life that ended here, in this place, with the others. And just as I felt his icy grip on my shoulder, pulling me into the darkness, I saw my own grave, freshly dug, with a headstone that read, "Here lies the Night Rider. Gone, but never forgotten." I'd been driving since 7 p.m. working the night shift like usual. There's something about the city after midnight that brings out the strangest characters. But this one was different. I'd never been so glad to see the sunrise as I was the morning after I met him. It was around 3:30 a.m. when I got the request. The pickup point was an old, abandoned gas station on the edge of town. I almost skipped it, but the app had been quiet, and I needed the fare. As I pulled up, my headlights cut through the thick mist hanging over the lot. There was no one in sight. But then, out of the fog, he appeared. Tall, thin, with a long black coat that seemed to blend into the night. He wore a dark fedora that shadowed most of his face, but as he stepped into the car, I caught a glimpse of his eyes. They were a pale, unnatural gray, almost glowing. He looked at me, and a chill ran down my spine. "Thanks for picking me up," he said in a low, gravelly voice. He didn't smile, just stared. "No problem," I muttered, forcing myself to look at the road instead of those haunting eyes. "Where to?" He didn't answer immediately, just kept staring at me through the rearview mirror. Finally, he spoke. "Let's go for a drive," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Anywhere specific?" I asked, my voice wavering. "Just drive," he replied. "You'll know where." His words left a sour taste in my mouth, and something about them felt wrong. But my hand, almost without thinking, shifted the car into drive. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to go along with it. We drove in silence, and after a few blocks, I realized he was watching me. Not just casually glancing, but watching, like he was studying every movement, every breath. "Are you from around here?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. "Not anymore," he replied, his tone cryptic. "But I used to be." There was something about the way he said it that felt like a warning. I wanted to drop him off, make an excuse, anything to get away, but when I glanced at the screen, my GPS wasn't showing a destination. In fact, it wasn't showing anything at all. The map was blank, just a gray screen with a dot marking our position. I tapped the phone, but it wouldn't respond. "That won't work," he said from the back seat, his voice soft but somehow sharp, like he knew exactly what I was thinking. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "You can't leave until we're done," he replied, leaning forward slightly, his face closer to mine in the mirror. "Until what's done?" I forced a laugh, hoping he'd take it as a joke. But he didn't laugh back. The streets around us were empty, darker than usual, almost like we'd slipped out of the city and into some place I'd never been before. No street lights, no signs, just a dark road stretching endlessly ahead, lined with trees that seemed to lean closer as we passed. I glanced at the gas gauge. It was dropping faster than it should have, nearly on empty even though I'd filled it up that morning. "Strange things happen out here," he murmured, almost to himself, his voice like a whisper in my ear despite the distance between us. "Have you seen it yet?" I didn't answer. My hands were shaking, and my foot was frozen to the pedal, pressing down like I had no control. My phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a new notification. A message from a number I didn't recognize. "Stop the car." My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I ignored the message and kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. But the phone buzzed again, and another message appeared. "Stop the car." I dared a glance at the mirror, and that's when I realized he was grinning, his mouth wide and unnatural, his teeth sharp and slightly too long. He didn't blink, just kept staring at me with those pale, unblinking eyes. "It's time," he whispered. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. The engine sputtered and died, the lights flickering before they, too, went out. We were plunged into darkness. "Why? Why are you here?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He leaned forward, his face inches from mine, his eyes glowing in the dark. "I know your secrets," he whispered. "All of them." I felt my blood turn to ice. I had no idea what he meant, but something in his voice told me he did know. Things I'd never told anyone. Things I thought I'd left behind. "Please, I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered. "Oh, you do," he replied, his grin widening. "And so do they." I heard it then, a soft tapping on the windows, coming from all around us. I whipped my head to the side and saw pale faces pressed against the glass, eyes hollow, mouths open in silent screams. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like they were trying to get in. What is this?" I gasped, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "They're here for you," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. "Every lie, every betrayal, every dark thought, you've drawn them here. They're yours, after all." The faces outside grew clearer, more defined. I recognized them. People I'd wronged, people I'd hurt, people I thought I'd forgotten. Their hands scratched at the windows, their voices whispering my name, begging me to let them in. "Please. Please, I'm sorry," I whispered, barely able to breathe. The man in the back seat leaned back, folding his hands in his lap, his grin fading to a look of calm satisfaction. "It's too late," he said, almost kindly. "They've waited long enough." The doors unlocked with a soft click, and the windows began to fog from the inside, strange symbols appearing in the mist, written by hands I couldn't see. The tapping grew louder, turning to banging, rattling the car as the figures outside pressed closer, their faces contorted with rage and despair. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The doors creaked open, and the fog spilled into the car, thick and suffocating, swirling around me until I couldn't see, couldn't move. As the darkness closed in, I heard his voice one last time, calm and distant, like he was speaking from far away. "Drive carefully," he whispered. "You never know who you might pick up." And then there was nothing. Just an endless, empty road stretching into the night, with no one left to drive it.